Thank you so much for joining us today for the Rhetoric of Health and Medicine kind of author interviews where we're trying to get behind the scenes look at some of the work that we're publishing. I'm with Abby Dubisar and Sara Davis today, and they have a forthcoming piece, a persuasion brief, that is talking about sterilization and women's rights. And so we're just going to jump right in with the first question. If you could just give us some background and talk through how this project started and what you kind of got interested in it.
I was taking Dr. Dubisar's gender communications class in the fall of 2017, and part of our final project that we had to create for the class was a PK presentation. I'm not sure how to actually say the
cha-cha, where students create slides and they're timed.
Yeah, so she encouraged us to find a topic that we didn't elaborate on in class, and I thought of a couple ideas, and when I went to speak to her about my ideas, she said yes to sterilization. That one sounds great. So with kind of her guidance, I was able to set up my project. I went to doctors' offices to collect pamphlets. I spoke to the doctor that I had personally seen. I guess the reason I was interested in the subject is because I am personally sterilized, and when I went through that whole process, it was interesting to me that it was difficult. I was met with questions. Are you sure you want to do this? Is this something that you've thought about? Have you considered other options? And I had to wait additional time that maybe a man wouldn't have to wait. My husband had already thought about being sterilized as well, but he backed out, and that's why I ended up doing it. But his experience was completely different. He was able to call up the doctor, make the appointment, and he could have had it done the next day. There was nothing else he needed to do. So I expected that same experience for myself, and that's not what I got. So it was an opportunity for me to kind of look into why that happened, and in doing that, I was able to see that there's a large community out there of women who are interested in this subject, who are facing kind of similar situations that I did, and they're wanting to talk about it. So that's how it got started. It started in this class as a research project, and then we kind of kept talking about it, and Dr. Dubisar actually approached me later and said, I think we should work together on this. There's an opportunity for a grant that we can apply for. Are you interested? And I said yes. So I probably would not have pursued this further had she not presented this to me as
So Abby, what was just so intriguing, or what was the moment where you just thought this needed to be pursued more? What led to that?
Because the topic that Sara pursued is an issue that rhetoric folks really need to know about. And so
I agree.
When I teach this course, which it's cross-listed between speech comm and women's and gender studies, and on the first day of class, when students are introducing themselves to each other, I ask them to think of a time in their life or in a friend's life or something they've read when gender, culture, and communication all interlink together, and we sort of keep track of these three issues and the orbits around them. And this was Sara's example, and I just was so struck by this example that, first of all, has really high stakes, also is about communication at its core. And you know, I get, like, Sara is amazing in many ways, but the bravery and honesty on the first day of a class when you're with 30 people you've never met and your professor to say, like, I tried to, get this procedure done to my body and I, faced all of these challenges, I think surprised students and was very dynamic. And so that she really hit the ground running on, I care about this topic. And Sara's an English ed major and she starts student teaching tomorrow. So sort of thinking about the ways we communicate about issues in an array of other ways. She's very invested in addressing taboo topics. And again, like, that's what I see as the role of my teaching in providing, classrooms can never truly be quote unquote safe spaces or totally student centered in the ways that many of our classrooms work these days. But by saying, like what are the issues that are important to students that research has been done about, and where are there gaps in research that we can do more with. And then two, the just very persuasive element in Sarah's final presentation about having a personal experience, talking to people we know about this. I myself, like Sarah, talked to my healthcare provider, who I know identifies as a feminist, is trained as a midwife. And as soon as I brought this issue up to her, she said, well, you know, some women may think they know, but they, you know, there's just, and so that has just struck me so dynamically. And this person also sent us some resources, like one of the communication bulletins about elective sterilization, and she's very eager to read our article once it's finished. So it's definitely increased dialogue between me and my friends, me and my colleagues, and me and my own healthcare provider, which is the exact purpose of why I want to do this work. So yes, I think for me, being invested in undergraduate research, and I'm on the 4Cs board for undergraduate research, on the board of Young Scholars in Writing, and working with undergraduate writers in those capacities, I think it's important for people like me to be very open and honest with undergraduate writers about how much work it takes to perform academic research and publish. And is that really worth it to you? You know, if you're not going to pursue, depending on what your future pursuits are, that sort of time commitment is something to think about. So, and I've been very vocal on my own campus about undergraduate research and the humanities. Mm-hmm. Another project Sarah and I could do is sort of the way undergraduate research here is imagined as a student working in a lab on a professor's project. And exactly, the displays for the award we got even, the way we had to persuade power brokers about how much time writing takes and research takes, as opposed to being able to clock in and out of the lab. So this is very important to me as someone who wants to increase visibility of humanities scholarship with undergrads. So having someone who's a very committed student, an excellent writer, a passion for research, and then this grant possibility coming together. And Sarah has had some other opportunities to talk about this research, which maybe we'll get into if it's interesting to you, but sort of all the different ways that she's been able to talk about her work to different audiences is what makes undergraduate research a high impact practice, and that's what I'm interested in.
And I love the fact that you've connected it to their broader, you know, educational goals, the high impact practice, in the focus on humanities, which is so key today. Oh my God, it's so key. And it feeds in, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview, oftentimes our assistant editors do them, which is great because I don't have the time to do all of them. But I wanted to do this one because when I read your piece, when you very first submitted it, it's so accessible, the language of it, which oftentimes we may assign research pieces in our courses, but they're really hard for the students to get through. This one is so well written and so straightforward. And I was like, okay, this is something I can use in my class. And then we have a graduate student who works on the journal. And so she reads everything and helps us with copy editing. And when she got done copy editing your piece, she said, this is mortifying. This really happens? And so it all feeds together into just sort of these ideas. I know I want to use it, but how would you use it? If you were teaching a class, a different class than the one that you took with Dr. Dubisar, Sarah, how would you tell somebody to, like, from a student's perspective, what would you want to work with? How would you want to work with this piece? Does that make sense?
For me as a student, not as a teacher, right?
Well, you can do both because you're about to launch into a teaching career, so you can merge those things together if you want. I just really would love to hear how you would use it.
Well, as a student, if I had received this article and somebody else had written it, when I was taking Dr. Dubisar's class, I would have immediately related to it. And I think that's important. One thing that I found doing the research is that there are multitudes of young women out there who are considering sterilization, and they're between the ages of 18 and 30, which is the age when most physicians will say absolutely no. And so, and even in other conversations here on campus with young women, and I was able to present at a Feminist Friday discussion, a couple of the women came up to me afterwards, and they were clearly younger, and they said, this is something that I've wanted to do, and I've talked to my doctor about it, and I've been told no. So I think the relatability of the piece is excellent for a classroom setting about gender and communication, just because there's a lot more people out there thinking about it than we realize. Because I think it is such a taboo subject, not too many people are openly speaking about it. So in that sense, I think it's excellent for a classroom, and also to get the conversation started, to let young men and young women know that this is something that they could pursue if they want, that there are other options out there for them besides having children. That's not something that's integral to your existence. And we want to let people know that this is an option for them, and to kind of help them navigate that communication that they might have with a healthcare provider, so that they go in prepared and knowing what questions they might be asked and having answers ready that will help them achieve the goal that they set out to achieve. And then from a communication standpoint, it's an excellent subject to study when we're talking about rhetoric and the way that information is presented in a way that is biased or that is unbiased. So it's a good way for students to study actual communication and rhetoric of communication. So in a medical way and a communications way, I think it's an excellent piece to study. And if I were to use it in a future classroom at maybe the secondary level, who knows, maybe I'll go on to teach college one day. We'll see what happens. But if I were to use it in a high school setting, which, like you said, the language is very accessible, I think we could definitely use it in a secondary setting, and I would use it for the same purpose, to address communication, to address gender equality, to address rhetoric, and it probably would need to be 11th, 12th grade when they're more prepared to read something of this magnitude. And it would also be, I think, empowering for young women to read, effective for young men to read. So I think it's beneficial to both genders.
Yeah, and that raises kind of a follow-up question for either one of you. It is a taboo subject, and that is always hard to bring up in classrooms. And, you know, Abby and I are more experienced teachers, but we have so many folks in higher education who are new or are unexperienced in dealing with how do you bring up a taboo subject. So what would you suggest as an approach to newer teachers or teachers who are just starting to move into these areas that are more difficult to teach? How would you start that?
I don't think kids are as delicate as some people think they are.
Excellent.
Shy away from taboo subjects, and I see myself getting into trouble teaching in more conservative areas like Iowa, because I don't see a problem with this subject. For me, it's not taboo. For me, this is something that needs to be discussed. And the more taboo it is in this context, the more I think people should hear about it. And when somebody puts up a wall or says, I don't want to hear this, I say, well, obviously you need to hear it. So I think for me, I would just dive right in. But I can understand somebody else might be more sensitive, or they might be more apprehensive about sharing something that's taboo. So maybe starting small and introducing things like Feminist Perspective, or introducing the idea of discussing rhetoric. And when we're looking at communication, these are the things that we're going to look at. So maybe come at it in a softer way, and then introduce the more difficult subjects and say, you know what, some of these things are taboo, some of them might be offensive, but we're looking at ideas. We're not looking at people necessarily. We're not making any attacks, assumptions. We're looking at ideas, and we're going to evaluate these ideas.
Oh, that was great. Abby's going, I'm so proud.
In the class that Sarah took, and again, it's a class focused on gender, so that already sets the scene. Not that I haven't gotten teaching evaluations that say this class talked about women's issues too much, even though it's women's and gender studies class, but that's another topic. So, so we watched the documentary, The Purity Myth, which summarizes Jessica Valenti's book by the same topic. So one of my pedagogical strategies is having someone external to the class, an external expert, bring in, like, transition our discussions from, you know, what are gender roles and how do those relate to physical appearance? So what Valenti does is she looks at the cultural construction of virginity, points out how it has no medical definition, how it's a very, very powerful cultural, ideological myth that exists in various systems. And within 40 or 50 minutes, she connects that to abstinence-only education and our tax dollars being spent to basically lie to students in public schools. And so for many of Sarah's classmates, this is very shocking. And some of them have literally had the same abstinence educators that are featured in the documentary come to their schools. So it's,
oh my God.
yeah. And so this leads to an assignment once they've learned about different theories of gender and communication, and they've learned about how gender is taught in schools, and we've watched this film, they are tasked in class with designing an ideal sex ed curriculum. And so this just generates a lot of really interesting ideas of sort of, you know, how do we ethically educate students about these issues? What are some of the creative ideas? And even in Sarah's own class, like, there was one student who was out to the class, who identifies as queer, and talked about, like, sex ed should address how to, you know, get pregnant if you don't have access to sperm, like those sorts of issues too. So the students always take it in directions that I can't necessarily predict. But this issue of what role does the government play in our access to healthcare always comes up, because Valenti gets into, like, the cervical cancer drug that was blocked because of its, you know, conservative interests in promiscuity and purity. So I think it's, you know, she's not a perfect writer, as none of us are, and it's not a perfect book or film, but it does such a good job of connecting these first systems that show students how gender ideologies operate in these really powerful ways that block healthcare from us in the United States, even though many students in the class may think we have access to the healthcare we need to thrive in the United States. So that's another context, just to give one example of using a sort of text that within an 80-minute class period can really push on our thinking about how power, communication, and healthcare are all interlinked in ways that we may not even understand or fully appreciate on a day-to-day basis. So, so yeah, that's just one example of how I think you could use that in a variety of different classes, especially because they talk about sex ed and schooling, and since gender and school are just so, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't know that there was a documentary that went with that book, so to speak. Huh, yeah. That's good to know, because I've read the book.
Right, and it's super helpful as a teacher. You know, I try to be very aware of how much my students are spending on books, and to be able to get these very rich arguments in a documentary. And it's available through, like, the Media Commons Film Access database that our university uses, and so they can watch it on their own time as well if they miss class. Just thinking about accessibility, although I do think there's value in showing such films in class together. But yeah, I really recommend it.
Excellent. See, this is why I asked this question. It was really selfish. It was all about me. And but these are important resources that the RHM community is trying to think through as to how can we make sure that we take all the great stuff that we're doing and enhance our teaching. And Abby, as you said, this notion of undergraduate research, so many of us are involved in that. It's like, how can we make that even better? Which kind of transfers into the next question is, so the two of you, I think in some ways it was serendipity that you all came together, but could you think through and potentially offer some suggestions on how you can nurture this sort of collaboration that others can follow or try to implement?
Well, one thing I think is unique about our situation is that I'm a non-traditional student. So I connected more with my professors than I did with my peers because I'm 10 plus years older than most of my peers. So I think in that sense, it was a lot easier for me to work with Dr. Dubisar than maybe some of my younger peers might feel. Like I came to class that first day and I was ready to just share everything that's happened to me. But I worked in a medical office for 6 years as a medical assistant. It was all very familiar to me, and I have no problem sharing my life stories with people. So I think that was a positive for me. But I also think, like I said, I might not have pursued this research outside of class had she not approached me and said, I think we should do something more. So when professors are interested in the success of their students and they see something that can turn into something more, if they approach their students and offer their mentorship, I think that's very helpful, and that kind of helps foster these types of relationships.
For me, I think that, and I have done this in a different class. I teach a pop culture analysis class where I teach them 7 forms of rhetorical criticism of pop culture. And I had 9 students who did really interesting work with feminist criticism. So 6 of them elected to work with me, and we published in Computers and Composition. So my answer to this question for faculty is assign projects that your colleagues in your field want to, I'm trying to think of the best verb I can think of here, learn from. And so our students come with all this incredible knowledge and put the rhetorical tools to use that we teach them, and sort of thinking about, for a faculty, keeping an awareness open constantly of, people in my field could really learn from Sara and what she's doing. How can I amplify this work to broader audiences so that my colleagues in the field can learn from this person who's doing such smart work, which in a perfect world legitimizes classroom assignments, which can be very artificial.
Yes.
So for many of my students, these are academic performances that are artificial to earn their academic credit to get their degree. But for other students, and something I'm always trying to be aware of as a teacher, is where are all these different ways that we can look for other audiences who need to learn from our students. And for me, that comes in with assignment design. And so even if no one in my field necessarily needs to see like Sara's Pacheco presentation, the way that served the rhetorical purpose in the classroom it needed to serve, that she did outside research about gender communication, could perform rhetorically in class to show her classmates and me that she did that, serves that purpose. But then there's all these other ways that can be revised, which I think, I don't want to speak for Sara, but what she's done with this work, like leading the discussion at the Women's Center for Feminist Friday, she delivered a poster presentation at the Undergraduate Research Symposium. We don't have funding for her to present at an academic conference, but we could try to get some. We haven't figured that part out yet. She's also written a personal essay. And so thinking about different genres, like what does RHM need to know? What in a personal essay can she tell people about her experience? That's why I love being in rhetoric, because you can teach students like audiences of what they need to know. So yeah, the folks at Feminist Friday and the questions they asked Sara were very different from the ones that she got at the Undergraduate Research Symposium, which was she was the only humanities student there out of over 100 students, right? So, right, it's like baby steps. So yeah, so that's, I don't know, I could go on, but that's good enough.
And so the two of you got a grant. Could you talk just a moment about that and the importance of those sorts of resources?
Yeah, I'd never heard of undergraduate research to this magnitude before. My husband was working on his PhD, and that's why we came to Iowa State. So I knew there was tons of funding out there for master's and PhD and publishing in that venue, but I'd never heard of undergraduates actually completing research and being published. And so that was exciting for me, especially since I am an older student, and I feel like maturity-wise, that's something that is fun for me, something that's interesting to me. And I don't have the opportunity right now to pursue a master's degree. So being able to conduct research, kind of original research, and collaborate with a mentor has been an awesome experience for me. And I think this was the first year of this grant. So we're kind of the inaugural class of this grant. It hadn't been offered before, and I think they're hoping to have even more students apply and make use of this grant starting in the spring and the fall. So Iowa State's doing a good job at looking for opportunities for their undergraduate students to participate in authentic research that is their own and not necessarily just like working in a lab. And I think humanities research is vastly different than other sciences, because we aren't working in a lab. We're working within literature, and we're writing and we're researching in person with people. So it's very different, and I don't think there's a lot of emphasis placed on research within the humanities. We don't really see a lot of funding that's available for students like myself. So it's nice to have these opportunities where our research is recognized, and I think that's going to be helpful for students in the future who also want to pursue research.
I like that idea of recognition, because oftentimes when we start thinking about what resources do you need, or what kind of infrastructure do you need to pursue these sorts of things, sometimes just being acknowledged for the great work and having somebody say, way to go, it's vastly important to keep it going and then to also build that kind of culture. That's such a smart answer.
Yeah, we should talk about, so with and even the words we use about the money, like grant versus award versus scholarship, this was something we had to figure out. Yeah. What was your hourly wage? Was it $12 an hour? Yeah. So that's another thing, like institutions, if they want to invest in undergraduate research, need to pay them a competitive wage. So it was worth it to Sarah to do this versus getting a different summer job. Yeah. And so sort of thinking about, and for me, like getting $500 of professional development money, that definitely helped me, right? And so to acknowledge that mentoring, while it is extremely rewarding, and I would definitely, I continue to do it in many different contexts, to acknowledge that it is work and takes time. And even the way you started off with talking about the accessibility of our writing, I mean, in a very selfish way, I love working with Sarah and undergraduate researchers because it makes me think about my writing in a new way of just a collaborator who is new enough to, like, she's read many, many journal articles that are published by academic journals, but that writing of how do we make this clear to each other, to our readers, is so selfishly valuable to me, to just help me I'm an over-introducer. I have all these writing problems that working with someone like Sarah helps me deal with even more. So yeah, I think that's something else that institutions need to think through is, and Sarah did keep a timesheet, and we did, even thinking about writing in time and research in time, humanities research can be very messy because the lab looks different. And so, even thinking about, does she have to be in a specific location while she's doing this work, even though we have all this access to materials and things like that, was just a really interesting conversation, ongoing conversations that we had to have. And recently Sarah spoke with the advisory board for our college, and I don't know who any of these people are. As a faculty member, I would probably never meet these folks, but among the student panelists who'd all received awards like Sarah's, even though I think all of the half dozen or so are pursuing publication in some way, Sarah was the only student who's the first author. And to me, that is just, again, so significant that we must legitimize what we value in academic publishing contexts with undergraduate researchers if we're really going to say we're doing this, and undergraduate perspectives, their research is so important. And actually one of the advisory board members, so a member of the community that's invested in liberal arts and sciences in some ways, literally asked this question: were you actually pursuing your own research, or did the faculty member you were working with tell you what you're finding? And I just wanted to stand up and thank this person as they were asking it, because that I was really so just pleased that my dean got to hear that question, because that's the sort of question I'm asking too when these issues come up and when I'm trying to be more vocal about the importance of supporting the humanities in these ways. And I'm very, like, there is definitely power from the margins, and I'm very invested in this, like at a research university that's known for ag and tech work, but we're also a land grant institution invested in the common good for all people. That is, like, that includes elective sterilization. And so,
yes.
And so being able to hear other people sort of buttress what I've been working on too was just, and that's all possible because Sarah was willing to talk to this panel of folks, so, or this group of folks. So that's another audience that she got to talk to, because to the best of my knowledge, this award is funded by donors. So
wow, that's great.
And this is also, like, these sorts of stories of undergraduates doing research are very persuasive to donors, and so the greater visibility we can bring to those. So that's maybe the audience that was most, where this topic would be the most taboo, or as far as we know, because we just don't know them, as well as some of the other audiences she's spoken to. So that was really interesting.
But it also goes to show the power of what rhetoric is, the everydayness of it, and the fact that in a women and gender studies course, which as an interdiscipline has received all sorts of flack on all different sorts of levels, but to show that there is a very practical and applied and important takeaway from a course on gender and communication. Oh, the power of rhetoric. Yeah, my heart's all full.
Good. And it fulfills a diversity requirement. So there are majors from all across the university. There are future accountants in there, computer scientists. I had a software engineer most recently too. Yeah, so that's another thing too. Like, I love this idea of applied women's and gender studies, and applied, to say that, women deserve to, within a set of constraints, get what they need for their bodies is diversity, or is like something extra, is something that needs discussion in these classes too. So that's something we talk about as well. Yeah, it's a really great course.
So the final question, and I'm going to word it in kind of two different ways for each of you. So Sarah, if you were standing in front of a room of 100 OBGYN doctors, what is the one thing based on your research you want them to know?
Your personal bias does not have a place in your office. Would be
wow, that's good.
Take away from this. I worked for an OBGYN, and so I have up close and personal experience with some of this physician-patient discourse. And I've made phone calls to Planned Parenthood, and I've set patients up with various doctors. I've set up elective sterilizations with the general surgeon. I've done things like that for patients. And so just having been in that environment and being on both sides now, I want doctors to really understand that yes, they may have their ideas, yes, they may feel like they don't want this to happen, but if they are trained to do it and they are offering the service, I don't think they have a right to turn someone down because they think that that person might change their mind in the future. I don't think they should be projecting their feelings on their patients. And yes, you have to address many different things when you're talking to a patient and evaluating them for surgery, because surgery comes with risks. And we're not saying that this is a surgery without possible complications and possible risks, but any surgery comes with risk, comes with possible complications. There just is a lot of surrounding this subject.
It goes back to the idea of taboo and stigma and
shaming.
And the cultural notion that we're supposed to have children.
Exactly.
No matter what, and we don't have to. So that was the other thing that I was really drawn to this piece about, because I do not have children, and that's a story for another day, but it's also this ongoing sort of thing. It's like, why do you not have children? Back off. So I love that answer. for Abby, I would just shift the question just a little bit. If you were talking to a room of rhetoricians who have decided they're going to try to do projects kind of like this with their students, and you had this as an example text, what would be the one thing that you really want them to know?
I think it would be to see your undergraduate students as potential collaborators, which sounds really simple, but try to talk through the constraints that prevent faculty from seeing their undergraduate students as potential collaborators. But I think sort of the piece is a great model. So what we said initially, I mean, the fact that your journal exists is a huge gift to us, and I know you do so much work on it, so we're very, very grateful, because without your journal, I'm not sure what we would have done. Like, you made it possible, so thank you.
Yes, you are very welcome.
So being able to say to Sarah, you know, I know why folks in rhetoric need to know about your project. You're the expert on the arguments that need to be made about this issue, and thinking through the connections between expertise in rhetoric and expertise in a different topic, and how those can connect with our students really well. And then I could break down the article looking at how collaboration is possible, because I think for some faculty, if they don't understand their undergraduate students as potential collaborators, they might just think it's too much work to teach someone, mentor someone through the process of academic publishing. They might have their own insecurities about writing and research as well. Their institution may not value collaboration with students, so there are these infrastructural issues that need to be considered as well. So even like talking with your department chair about such issues might be part of it too. But I think our piece serves as a model for seeing how the evolution from a classroom assignment to a student's more expanded research on that classroom assignment to something your field needs to know about could be charted in a really interesting visual way that attends to how our collaboration worked as that evolved.
Oh, that's so lovely. It really is. I'm sort of, it's a new year. I'm feeling invigorated after this conversation. I have, you know, my hope has been restored in many things. So I'm so thankful for your time.